Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to this very special critical event. We are today talking about the faster melting of the Himalayan glaciers. Is it a global crisis at tipping point? I'll introduce you again to our panelists in a second. My name's Lucy Siegel. I'm an author and a broadcaster based in the UK, working on climate and nature. This is obviously an issue very close to my heart, as it is, I'm sure, to yours. So we know that the Himalayan glaciers are melting at a very fast pace for the past 4 decades. Reports have indicated that they may severely shrink, and some believe the majority will disappear by 2100 as a consequence of climate change and pollution. Now, of course, this has disastrous consequences for those living in the region and also for the wider world. What happens there doesn't stay there. As we always say about the Arctic, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. Now, the Himalayas are the third largest source of frozen water after the North and the South Pole. And today at Open Forum, we endeavour to understand the gravity of the situation, and we are going to talk to our experts and see if we can start to access what needs to be done. Let's see a short video now about how the Himalayas are changing. So it's a really heartrending and obviously very concerning short video when you start to see those facts. And I'm really, really grateful for you for sparing the time today to come and discuss this. So let's discuss, as the slide says. Let me introduce you again to our panelists. I know you've seen their images come up. So today we have with us Joydeep Gupta, who is South Asia Director of the Third Pole. Thank you so much for joining us, Joydeep. Thank you. We have Dr. Martin A. Mills, who is Director of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research. Good morning, Martin. Thank you for joining us. And we have Jennifer Tolman, who is Senior Policy Advisor for Climate Diplomacy and Geopolitics at E3G. Good morning, Jennifer. Thanks for being with us. So the way this is going to work is we're going to hear from each of our experts, each of our panelists for a few minutes, and they're going to give us some context and they're going to give us their perspective. I know Dr. Mills has carried out a very substantive piece of research that he will also talk about. And then we would love to take your questions. So please keep them coming. You can post those in the box and I will divvy those up to the panelists. If you want to ask a specific panelist, please indicate in your question. Otherwise, I'll decide. Let's stay tuned for a really gripping debate. I'm also really conscious that many of us were at COP26 in Glasgow. Martin's joining us from Aberdeen in Scotland this morning. And I have to say, I did not hear that much about the Himalayas. It wasn't something that I found that was a huge discussion there. So it would also be interesting to address that point as well. But first of all, let's go to Joydeep Gupta, who is South Asia Director for the Third Pole, who would tell us put the faster melting of the Himalayan glaciers into the current context. Joydeep, over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, Lucy. Well, as Lucy pointed out, and as you saw in the video, the glaciers in the Himalayas are melting faster due to climate change. And there is a question about how fast they're melting and what the impacts are. So the latest research we have is from the International Center of Integrated Mountain Development, which is a regional research center based out of Kathmandu in Nepal and has all the countries in the Hindu Kush Himalayas as its members. According to their research, by 2030, and that's just about 8 years from now, overall the glaciers are expected to lose between 10 and 30% of their mass. By 2050, it will go up to 25 to 35%. In the longer term, in the Karakoram range, which is on the western edge of the Hindu Kush Himalayas, the loss is expected to reach 35%. In the Pamir Mountains, on the north that joins the Hindu Kush Himalayas to the northern parts of the Asian High Asia, the Tian Shan and the Tibetan Plateau, 45% loss. And it's in the eastern Himalayas. That's the most serious loss is now being forecast, between 60 and 95% receding of glaciers by the end of the century. And all these, worryingly, very worryingly, all these are based on a moderate greenhouse gas emissions scenario. As Lucy pointed out, we found out during COP26, the world is still not on a moderate emissions greenhouse gas scenario. We are on a high emissions scenario where this process is going to be accelerated. And this is getting worse. And we are now seeing that the Himalayan region, as a result of what's going on, is warming faster than the global average. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has calculated that right now we at a global average are what, 1.17 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Compare that to the Himalayas, which is more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels already. And all these are getting worse all the time. The last winter, we're just starting another winter in South Asia and in the Himalayas. Last winter, hopefully that was an anomaly, but last winter we did see that even in the dead of winter, the ice and snow around Mount Everest was melting. And you can well imagine what it means when ice and snow around the world's tallest peak melts in the dead of winter. And this, I know, was given this. That we have heard that this may not be true in all winters. This was the first time this was recorded. And I do hope that this is definitely not something that will be repeated. So, as you can see from this animation, the snow line on the glaciers in the Everest region is rising. What does this mean? It means the glaciers are rising. That means they're receding. They're melting at a higher point. That means they're melting faster, they're melting quicker. Now, the organizers and Lucy also asked me, what is the impact of all this? Let's understand the impact of what happens when glaciers melt. Because you'll hear a lot of scientists saying quite correctly that if you look at the annual average of rivers coming down from the Himalayas, the big rivers, whether it's the Mekong or the Ganges or the Indus or the Brahmaputra or the Yangtze, only about 5% of their total water flow comes from glaciers. Most of it comes from rain and snowmelt. It is a bit higher in the Indus, which gets less rain and snow, but overall it's around 5%. So you will hear that, oh, okay, it shouldn't matter too much. It's only 5%. but it does matter. It matters especially in South Asia and in Southeast Asia, because these South Asia especially is a region of the world where 80% of your annual rainfall and snowfall comes in the 4 months of the monsoon. What does this mean? It means rivers in South Asia are running high for 4 months of the year and running low 8 months of the year. And in those low flow months, it's in those low flow months that this 5% becomes crucial. So, right now, we are still in a faster melting period. So, are not seeing water shortages as a result of the faster melting during the lean season. But once these glaciers have lost enough ice, all scientists tell us that we are going to start seeing water shortages in the non-monsoon months all over South Asia and parts of Southeast Asia, especially those parts that are dependent on the Mekong Basin. And quite possibly, this will also happen in Central Asia, because both the major rivers of Central Asia, Amu Darya and Sindh Darya, are very highly dependent on glacier melt from the Pamir region and the Tian Shan Mountains. So, yes, in terms of water availability, this has got very serious impacts on about 2 billion people. A quarter of the world's population is dependent on these waters. So it matters. It matters not only to this region, because of the numbers, it matters to the entire world. And we need to figure out how to sort this out. There is no way we are going to be able to keep the glaciers from receding. So how do we deal with the impending water shortages? And while we are planning for impending water shortages right now, we have to deal with flash floods because of the receding of glaciers. Now, you see what's happening is that when glaciers melt faster, the area at the snout of the glacier is unable to take that water away, to drain that water away as fast. The that's a completely soaked moraine kind of area, and if the glacier is melting faster, it cannot take that water away faster. It's already oversaturated. So what happens? A lake forms at the mouth of the glacier, or called the snout. And that lake keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is something that's happening all over the Hindu Kush Himalayas. And those lakes have boundaries made out of very unstable rocks and mud, little bits of mud. And when the water volume increases to the point where the walls cannot hold that water anymore, it all bursts out in a flood. And that is what the scientists are nowadays calling GLOF, glacial lake outburst flood, and more are happening. And this is something that's already affecting people all over. There are stories whose links I can share with you if you're interested in the details. Surging glaciers are already creating lakes and floods in Pakistan, in India, in Nepal, in Bhutan, all over. And as the glaciers disappear, we really cannot be far behind, for the reasons I just explained to you. We already know that in Kashmir, for example, the Kolahai Glacier, the main glacier in Kashmir, its retreat has already hit very, very lucrative farming like that of the saffron crop. The famous saffron crop of Kashmir is already being hit because they're not getting enough water, because the glacier is receded to a very large extent. And benchmark glaciers in the Himalayas, like that at the mouth of the Ganges, keeps receding. So there are two reasons for why it's happening. One is global warming, the other is pollution. The pollution that comes from India and China mainly, and is darkening that this entire area with soot. Right now, I'm sitting in New Delhi, which has got severe pollution haze all outside, all around my flat. And this suit goes and sits on the glaciers. The scientists will tell you, I suppose Dr. Mills will explain this, that when soot goes and sits on a surface of ice, it darkens that surface. So that surface is going to absorb more heat and the melting rate will increase. So the pollution complements the effects of global warming, the impacts we are already seeing. The impacts are predicted and projected to get worse. And we really need to figure out right now, in the mode of disaster management, how we are going to deal with it. I think I'll stop here, Lucy, and uh, may hopefully come back if there are questions, etc.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Joydeep. That was incredibly insightful and precise explanation. I think when you hear the term anthropogenic climate change, it's only when you start hearing from somebody like you and you hear about how the mountains, the glaciers are being reshaped by this force that you understand the true impact. I found that very emotional as well. So God knows what I'm going to be like by the end of this. But this is already we're getting comments saying, why don't we hear more about this? I think that's from somebody listening in the UK. And I wish we'd had this conversation before COP26 from my point of view. We're going to hear more now from Dr. Martin A. Mills, who are very lucky that Martin is able to join us today. Now, Martin is the director of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research, as I pointed out before, and he was author of a working paper that the Scottish Centre has produced for the Scottish Parliament. So over to you, Martin. The virtual floor is yours.
Lucy, thank you very much. Yeah, just to give some background to this. In January 2021, the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research produced a 40-page kind of basic public document on the nature of climate change in the Third Pole region. It was a result of a 2-year climate inquiry by the Scottish Parliament's cross-party group on Tibet. And we looked at kind of really about 900 scientific publications from all around the world, from the Chinese scientists, the Nepalese scientists, Indian scientists, American scientists, Australian, everywhere, basically speaking, that was producing, strong, legitimate scientific research on this area, really to generate a consensus idea of what is occurring to the third pole as a whole. We use this term, the third pole. It basically refers to the fact that the Tibetan Plateau and the mountains that surround it like a ring effectively contain enough ice in the form of glaciers, in the form of permafrost, in the form of snow to constitute a third pole. They actually have the third largest supply of frozen fresh water in the world. However, they are the only third pole, effectively speaking, that contains half the world's population sitting on its doorstep. And that's a major problem because the third pole region as a whole, the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayas, the Pamirs, the Karakorams, provide river water and freshwater supply for nearly all of Asia, all of its major rivers, the Yellow, the Yangtze, the Mekong, the Indus, the Ganges, the Irrawaddy, all of these rivers come out of the Tibetan Plateau and come out of the Himalayan and surrounding regions. And we really wanted to know what was happening there because we'd already seen policies that were occurring within the People's Republic of China that oversee the Tibetan region in particular, where we saw what was called the ecological migration policy, for example. Within the Tibetan Plateau, we'd already seen in one of our 2018 briefing papers, mass migrations of up to, the relocation and resettlement of 2.3 million Tibetans, for example. And a lot of that came under the ecological migration policy. And there was great debate as to how important climate change was in that process. And we really wanted to look at it. And the collective result of that research, as I say, which we published in January, was that the third pole region is, as a whole, undergoing a almost complete ecosystem shift. That its cryosphere, that is its domain of ice, which is comprised of three things. First is the glaciers. The second is the underlying permafrost. That is frozen ground, often in the form of really underground icebergs. That is often kind of that comes in a frozen region like Siberia or like the Himalayas, and its snow cover. All of these were shifting dramatically as a consequence of climate change and as a consequence of regional pollution and local policies. All of these things were contributing to really a massive shift. And we need to combine those things together because they actually produce cumulative results. And in this regard, we're really moving into what might be referred to as the sort of second stage of climate change, where climate change results begin to compound on top of one another. And yes, the results are fairly clear. The clear headline here is, for example, the glaciers across the Himalayas. The vast majority of them will probably be gone by the end of this century. The similar effects occur on the permafrost, which also has a profound effect on the underlying water distribution that feeds the rest of Asia. And really this feeds populations that have about 1.9 billion people around Asia, in China, in Southeast Asia, in India, in Pakistan, and in Central Asia. And these are really major shifts. They also affect the populations within Tibet itself and within the Himalayan region. And that's about 225 million people. And really what we're seeing to begin with, we're already seeing many of these processes that occur when the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas passed a tipping point. Now, our tipping point is really simple here. It's called 0 degrees centigrade. That is the point where ice turns to water. It's non-negotiable. And at that point, you've effectively speaking, in some sense, put the ice cube out in the sun, and all you have is time for that ice cube to gradually melt bit by bit. And this occurs to the glaciers, but also, for example, it occurs to surrounding mountains. Mountains in the Himalayan regions are actually held together by permafrost. That underlying deep-rooted soil ice holds mountain slopes together. And when it begins to melt, those slopes collapse. Now, we've seen this in the Tibetan regions and in the Himalayan regions in a vastly accelerated process, particularly since about the 1980s. The 1980s was, roughly speaking, 1980 was the point where the mean temperature of the Tibetan Plateau as a whole in the Himalayan regions moved above 0 degrees centigrade. And what we're seeing subsequent to that is that gradual melting of the ice cube, effectively. And as that process goes, and that process takes decades to occur, but we're in the middle of it now. We're 40 years into that process, and now we begin to see the really more dramatic results. As that process occurs, several things happen. The first is underlying permafrost, for example, begins to collapse underneath your feet. Now, as you and I all know, ice takes up a little bit more space than the water when you freeze it. So the ground underneath your feet, as it begins to turn to water, really kind of begins to collapse. And we've seen this in Siberian regions, we've seen this in Alaska, we've seen this in a whole range of areas that are covered by permafrost, which is about 25% of the world's population, the world's land surface. And we certainly begin to see it in areas like Tibet and the Himalayas and the Karakorams, where that underlying ground begins to, the ground under your feet begins to buckle. It begins to melt. And if you built a city on top of that, where you built a town or a community, if you built railways or roads or oil pipelines or gas pipelines on top of it, all of these are going to gradually break. I mean, one of the most sort of interesting headlines as far as this one was concerned, for example, the famous Lhasa to Beijing railway that crosses over a huge quantity of permafrost area, and really is the sort of major kind of transport supply route to Lhasa at the heart of the Tibetan Plateau. It is calculated that the ground underneath that railway is melting at a rate that railway will become possibly completely non-viable within about 15 years. It depends how hard Chinese engineers work on that. And the Chinese engineers work very hard on this, but there are some things you can't stop. And we certainly know that, underlying permafrost, if that's melting, effectively speaking, those transport links become non-viable. So it affects the entire economic area. And similarly with the Himalayan regions as a whole, the water supplies that come out of it, as the permafrost and the glaciers melt, one of the things that we're beginning to see a cumulative result is simply, to begin with, a kind of more water than less, but also throughout, as Joydeep commented, throughout the year, a cycle of flood and drought. Okay, and both of those are bad for human beings. They're bad for human communities. They're not just bad for human communities in the Himalayan regions, but they are bad for the year-long supply of fresh water that goes to major areas of the world. You know, we're already seeing the Yellow River in northern China, for example, seriously destabilizing. Its water supplies, you know, really breaking up. If we look at, for example, the Indus, we're already seeing population shifts occurring out of the high Himalayan regions as they are gradually sending their kids to school somewhere else, because the fields aren't growing the way they used to grow, because the water, as the permafrost underneath the ground melts, the water gradually drops down deeper and deeper, and it goes beyond what crops and grasses can reach. And so one of the major things we've seen across the Tibetan Plateau, for example, is desertification, as those grasslands simply can't be fed by the water because the water is just dropping deeper and deeper. The water table is falling. And we know this. I mean, the Tibetan Plateau as a whole, there were NASA, for example, they have what's called the Grace Follow-on Project, which looks at the way in which water moves underneath the ground. And the Tibetan Plateau itself as a whole is actually gaining water, oddly enough, but it's moving much, much deeper into the ground. So it's becoming effectively useless to human populations above it. And it's gaining that at about something on the lines of 7 to 9 gigatons per year, these are huge numbers. So as a whole, the report that we produced really presented a picture that sees a fundamental change in almost every aspect of the Himalayan ecosystems, and in particular, collapse of what we call its cryosphere, its domain of ice, which oddly enough is a translation of the Sanskrit word Himalaya. And that cryosphere shift will change the structure of the water cycles that effectively feed almost the entire Asian population, and will shift them to being much, much more seasonal. So we'll see, for example, the loss of a second harvest in the year. We'll see, for example, cities that if you have no water for a city or for factories, you can't run it for those months of the year. And if that's a city, unless you have a secondary source of water, that city will depopulate, it will empty. And we're already beginning to see some cities in Central Asia begin to gradually depopulate. So these are processes that are very much into at the moment. They've effectively been going on for 40 years. Really, the major tipping point was actually 40 years ago, it was in the 1980s. And the overall effect on things like the bread baskets of Asia, places like, for example, the Punjab, which is largely fed by the Indus, which is mainly glacial water, that will be seriously compromised, as will large sections of northern China. So across the board, we're seeing very dramatic results. And I'm afraid to say, these are not results we can stop at this point in time. The second element of the tipping point is that gravity is beginning to take over, as is the sun's power. And there really isn't much we can do to stop that at this point. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I mean, what an extraordinary. I'm now going to go back and read all your reports. So I got the opportunity to present this quite late. So I'm also gaining all of this knowledge as we go along. Martin, I just wanted to ask you just quickly. I want to know how you feel, having pinpointed all these tipping points, having discovered that the tipping point was 40 years ago. I just want to know how you grapple with the enormity of what your research has shown you, in a sense.
Well, I mean, a little like you, I come slightly late to this in the sense that, you know, I'm an anthropologist by training, and you know, the process of this was really kind of this vast, in-depth study of work by scientists that are much better than I am, that's for sure. But certainly the cumulative process of reading really good deep science by some of the world's really greatest minds, all of which point in a direction that says that nonetheless, despite the level of intelligence that we have missed the boat on this one. And it wasn't as though we weren't warned. The Club of Rome told us that this would happen in its report back in the 1970s. And many of these processes aren't just for Asia. I mean, the Tibetan Plateau, because of its great height and its enormous weight and size, I mean, the Tibetan Plateau is the size of Western Europe. It's at 4,000 meters. So this is our real advance notice of what is coming in our direction. But all of those processes were understood 50, 60, 70 years ago. We did understand this. We did know that this was coming. And actually, most leaders of the world received these as reports. This won't be news to them. As it turns out, if you ask for my response to that, it's profoundly depressing. We seem to lack the collective intellectual and moral capacity to address this really seriously. We get distracted all the time by a variety of different issues, but we are not facing the conditions of our existence. And this really is about the conditions of our existence. It's what makes human life possible. All human communities live within water cycles. That's it. That's the end of the story. And if we step outside them, we're done for. The atmosphere above our heads isn't hundreds of miles high. All of this occurs within the 7 miles of the troposphere. Now, most of us can walk 7 miles in a few hours. That's you walking to the top of the climate changing atmosphere. And that's the bit we've heated. That's what we've done. And we were told about this 50 years ago. We were told about it 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and 10 years ago. What we're doing now is seeing processes that at this point in time, we almost have no capacity to mitigate or stop. All we have to do, as Joydeep pointed out, is learn to adapt and evolve in terms of what will be very straitened circumstances over the next 100 years. For our kids, there's nothing much we can do. We can do stuff now, but the effects of it will be for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. But for our children and for our old age, I'm afraid we are stuck with the processes that we have already in train. There's too much momentum to it.
Okay, thank you. I know we've got a lot of questions along that theme, which we'll come to in a minute. We're now going to hear from Jennifer Tolman, who is the Senior Policy Advisor for Climate Diplomacy and Geopolitics at E3G. Now, Jennifer is going to focus on climate diplomacy, as you may expect, and the synergy of action required to address the issue. So that leads on very nicely. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think I have sat here, as many in the audience have, kind of getting increasingly nervous as the previous speakers were talking. And I think that is because this shows that this is an existential crisis. Now, I'm not surprised by these results. I would say that while I fully agree that there are now irreversible impacts that we will have to deal with, and I will talk about first steps for dealing with those in a second, a 2.7 degree world still looks very different from a 5 degree world. So what I would not say is, okay, there's no point tackling climate change anymore. Let's just embrace the coal and adapt the hell out of it. We do still need to act on climate, because while this tipping point may have already been breached, there are numerous other ones that we don't want to add to our long list of problems. So I would make a strong pitch from minute one to say that, yes, we are now facing some irreversible changes to this world, but there are many others that we have not breached yet, and I'm not sure we want to find out what exactly they are and how they interact and make our life even worse when they kind of get together. So big pitch, it is not just about adaptation. It is very much also still about mitigation, because it could get worse. Not only will it get worse, but it could get even worse. I think stepping back in terms of what we do about this situation, there are obviously kind of two very immediate pieces. I think one is the immediate adaptation pressures. What are we actually going to do about the disasters that we are already seeing and experiencing, about the displacement that we're already seeing? And that is really a space where we need to be investing a lot more in climate adaptation, in disaster risk management, in early warning mechanisms, particularly when it comes to glacial bursts, cloud bursts. And that is something that there is a space to do and a space to seek support from in places like the UN climate negotiations, COP26, as you just mentioned. It is not a perfect space. It is a space that is deeply underfunded when it comes to adaptation. So the commitment that we saw out of COP26 to kind of double global adaptation funding is very much a drop in the ocean when you look at the adaptation needs in these spaces. But it's also about countries really embracing adaptation planning. How good are the national adaptation plans for all of these countries? Are they actually considering that things may just get worse, so they're not just adapting to the status quo, but planning to adapt to future changes? These are some of the questions that need to be asked, and how can those countries, particularly with good satellite technology, help them, particularly around things like early warning systems? Some of these conversations are already taking place, but it's really clear that as we see climate impacts become part of our day-to-day life, we need to be doing more on this. And that is really what we're going to be looking at in those climate negotiations as we head to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt next year, and at every single climate negotiation following on from that, adaptation and recovering from losses and damages that are irreversible on our part of our reality. The big question is, how are we going to finance the changes that we need to make? And that is one that a lot of diplomatic effort is already underway around, but definitely more is needed, particularly when it comes to conversations about the role of development banks. We still see a lot of development banks, development finance architecture, think that we're in a business as usual world. And I think cases like this really show you can't have a development plan for Tibet that doesn't consider the fact that it's going to be facing extreme climate risk on a potentially monthly basis. So that is kind of the first bucket of cooperation and diplomacy that we need. The second one, which is harder and to a certain extent scarier for kind of people who aren't in the diplomatic world, is this conversation about extreme climate risk. What happens if we actually see kind of the foundation of predictable water, fresh water collapse for certain regions, in a region that is already fraught with geopolitical tensions, not the least in that kind of Pakistan, India, China triangle. And here, one of the big issues is that right now, a lot of the diplomacy that we see, a lot of, for example, the ministerial declarations that we see, the most recent one was in 2020 about the management of this transboundary watershed, they're at a Minister of Agriculture level. And while it is incredibly true that there are definitely food implications for this, and therefore agricultural ministers have an incredibly important role to play, extreme risk like this is really a national security issue. And so one of the first things that we really need to see is this actually being treated as a national security issue. We've compared it a couple of times to the Arctic. Well, in the same way that we have an Arctic Council, we probably need a Himalayan Council at national security level, where these countries have to deal with the fact that they have very different interests, that all of those interests are at risk with this tipping point now being breached. And how are they going to cooperate on that? And this is the thing, an agriculture minister can't overcome a geopolitical divide between India and China. A national security advisor, that's their day-to-day job. The main part of a national security kind of council and advisor's role is to figure out where cooperation still needs to happen, despite the fact that you might be in geopolitical opposition or potentially even conflict. And we should not kid ourselves. This could become a source of conflict. It is already becoming a source of conflict, particularly when we consider the fact that part of mitigating climate change right now, a lot of the strategies still involve large-scale damming projects, which obviously just exacerbate water scarcity issues. So there is a real conversation to be had here on the geopolitical side of things. And maybe to just lay out 4 quick steps. They won't be quick for the people having to do them, but hopefully just to kind of put them on the table and then we can have a discussion, is 1, we need more scenarios like this, but we need more scenarios that don't just talk about how the glacier will melt at what pace, but what impacts, what follow on impacts to expect from that. And those need to be prepared in a way that they can be put in front of a Himalayan Council, in front of national security advisors, people who are used to having to plan for extreme risk. Secondly, we need to strengthen the agreements that we have. We do need to set up this sort of Himalayan Council structure, but we also need to have a much better way of addressing this in things like the UN system. We currently have a UN compact on water, but it is really ill-equipped to handle something this big and this political. And it's certainly not properly connected into the UN climate negotiations or the UN Security Council. So really thinking, what is the disaster risk management infrastructure that we need for these sorts of tipping points is going to be really critical. The third one is about monitoring. It's great that we have more data. It is fantastic that we have studies like this, but really we need to be deploying new satellite technology to get much better at data sharing, at monitoring, so that we know exactly where along the scenarios we are and what we need to be preparing. And that is something which, from my understanding from colleagues in the region, has been a huge issue, because exactly those geopolitical tensions have prevented effective data sharing. And that is obviously a huge risk for all countries involved. And finally, I don't think we should kid ourselves that some of the countries most impacted here are also major emitters. At the end of the day, both China and India both have national security interest in stopping this and mitigating this as much as possible. But China is the world's largest emitter at this point. Every second coal power plant is in China. And it was China and India who at COP26 stood up and said, look, we're not sure we can talk about coal phase out. It needs to be coal phase down. And I think that that disconnect is really dangerous. So actually getting much better conversations started within those countries about not just those who are impacted by the shift away from coal, the shift away from gas into more renewables, but also the people who are already being affected by our inaction. And part of that is obviously also China, India, and others in the region still putting pressure on America, Europe, other big emitters to deliver on their promises. But we really can't turn around and say, sorry, but we're not sure about this whole climate neutrality transition piece in the face of millions of people already facing displacement and water scarcity in your own country. And I just don't think that there are necessarily very good formats for that dialogue right now. So we hear a lot about the plight of coal workers, which is real and definitely is deserving of support. But conversations like this are frequently not as linked to climate change, certainly not in national media. And that is part of shaping public opinion and public kind of support and buy-in to hard but necessary transitions. I'll stop there for now, but happy to elaborate. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. That was incredibly important intervention. And we're getting a lot of questions and just people saying, please give some hope. So you gave us a lot of action points, and there's clearly a lot to be done if we can sort of park some of the anger about why wasn't it done over the last 4 decades. You mentioned national media. Hopefully we'll come back and maybe get a question about that, because I would say the international media is culpable in that regard as well. We are going to now take a couple of video questions. Jennifer, I think we'll probably come back to your 4 points for these as well. Could we play the first video question and then I'll put it to the panelists? Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Lobsang Yangso, an environment researcher of International Tibet Network, currently based in India. Tibet is also one of the front line of global climate crisis, warming 3 times faster than the rest of the world. Its glaciers are melting rapidly, permafrosts are thawing, and grasslands are degrading. However, the local Tibetan communities are not included in the Chinese government's environment policies. It is also almost no access and transparency in the joint scientific research on the impact of climate change in Tibet. Moreover, China is building a large number of dams on the older rivers that flow from Tibet to the downstream countries, affecting millions of people living there. So my question is, how can the downstream nations who are also affected by these policies can come together and solve these problems and also support Tibet? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Let's go back to you first, Jennifer, and just very briefly, if you would, because I'd like to get around all panelists, your response to that. You'd already pointed out some of the deficits in the UN regime, for example, and you'd also said that a Himalayan council was needed. Do you have anything else to sort of add in relation to that question?
Just to reinforce it, I think this is the problem. It's very diplomatically difficult to tell China how to run its consultation processes. what is a lot more feasible is if you already have a kind of multilateral format like an Arctic Council, like a Himalayan Council in this case, to build in structures for consultation of local communities in the way that we do use the Indigenous Peoples Platform in the UN climate negotiations, or also just give better space for smaller nations to coordinate amongst each other in the way that vulnerable countries do to great effect in the climate negotiations. But all of this relies on there already being a space where they have an automatic seat at the table, an automatic say in what is going on. Now, whether that gets implemented or not is another question, and that is one that we will have to take up in a separate conversation. But even just creating the space where they even have a chance to engage on this and a chance to influence the best practice of consultation practices on this sort of thing that can then be, used to certainly put great scrutiny on whether China is living up to this best practice or not. Even that is missing right now. So I think that would definitely be a first step. It wouldn't solve everything single-handedly, but it would certainly be the thing that would actually set up a diplomatic dynamic on this, which currently doesn't exist.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to go to Joydeep Gupta now and just get your response to that question.
Well, I agree with Jennifer to a large extent. The point is that, Lucy, you also referred to this in your introduction when you asked why we hadn't heard more about all this during COP26. I think we need to understand why large developing countries, especially China and India, engage in climate negotiations at all. They do not engage in climate negotiations for the same reason as North America or Western Europe does. They do it for what they see, or at least their governments see, as climate justice. This is again very different from the reason why smaller developing countries, the AOSIS and the SIDS or the LDCs, engage in climate negotiations. They engage in climate negotiations as an existential question. So when these countries, these large economies and emerging economies like China and India engage in climate negotiations, and when their main focus is on trying to get as much of the carbon space as possible from the developed world, on the argument that the developed world has taken up too much carbon space already, when that is the main focus, then they're not going to however much you say, they're not going to talk about their climate affected populations at these forums. This is quite different from what the government of Maldives will do, or from Kiribati will do, or even Nepal will do. So we need to understand this, to understand why this is happening, what's happening. Coming specifically to Lobsang's question, as a journalist, Lobsang knows this. I've been trying to get information on this from Tibet for many years. And it is almost impossible to get corroborative evidence out of Tibet that I could publish on our news website. And that is why we have not been able to do this, which is not to say that Chinese scientists are not looking at the situation. I know that the Institute of Tibetan Plateau Research, which works under the Chinese Academy of Sciences, is looking at glaciers receding in a big way. But where is the civil society over there in Tibet with whom we could talk, get independent information, and get that information corroborated from multiple sources? I simply don't know of any.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We're slightly ahead of the question. We've got another video question, which I'm going to put in here, and then I'll come to you, Martin, but just because we've already moved on to this territory. But let's hear this very interesting question.
It is a fact that environmental NGOs such as Greenpeace and the likes have increasingly embraced environmental justice and interconnections between the human rights abuses and environmental degradation. Yet there's no mention of human rights abuses in Tibet or the Chinese destructive environmental policies in Tibet by the environmental NGOs. What do you think is the reason behind the environmental NGOs' engagement with Xi Jinping's China and opting to stay silent on Tibet, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. How can Tibet climate activists lobby for the protection of Tibet's environment and to be heard?
Okay, so Martin, we haven't heard from you for a while, so I'm going to come and do feel free to pick up on any of the previous as well. But we're starting to look more specifically at China's involvement and this international regime or process.
Yeah, sure. I'll answer several of those questions at once as far as this is concerned. I mean, I think the biggest thing to understand from my perspective is the drivers that are at work at climate change on the Tibetan Plateau and on the Himalayan regions. We need to understand what's involved there. There are basically three levels. We have local drivers such as urbanization on the plateau. You know, Lhasa, for example, the capital city, was about 6 square miles when in 1950, and it's now 160 square kilometers. We have huge increase in heat sources from mining, from infrastructure growth, from all of those local processes, and those affect local glaciers. They affect the permafrost under the ground. They affect all of those kinds of things. The second level are regional drivers. Regional drivers are things that Joydeep spoke about, for example, black particulate pollution. Now, the principal sources of black particulate pollution that are affecting the glaciers in the Tibetan Plateau as a whole, in the Himalayan region, they overwhelmingly come from the North Indian corridor. Okay, so in that regard, you know, in as much as that black particulate pollution is affecting the glaciers and causing them to melt faster, you know, that really is a kind of Indian, Nepalese, and South Asian problem. There is also black particulate population coming off places like Inner Mongolia, and that is affecting regions of northern Tibet like Amdo. And we know those are sourced. They've been sourced by carbon dating, effectively. So that's your second regional source. Your third one, however, is overall CO2 content in the atmosphere, and that is a global source because CO2 simply moves around so much. Now, if you look at what the major drivers are, overwhelmingly, the regional drivers are stronger than the local drivers, and the global drivers are stronger still than both of those two. So an important thing to understand here is, one is that both in terms of causes and effects, this is an international problem, all right? It is not a country-specific problem. But also, and here's a way of thinking about this puzzle, China is not entirely, and even only partially in control of the climate change effects on the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayan regions. All right, and the effects that it has, that those climate change effects have on China as a whole, which we know are dramatic. China's environmental challenges are gargantuan. Those changes cannot actually be controlled by them. They have to be controlled internationally. I mean, this is an area where, you know, we really not only need to know more in terms of adaptation, and the Chinese, for example, have put monitoring stations in areas that are useful to them. So, for example, along the railway on the eastern Tibetan Plateau, for example, where it feeds down into the mainland China. But we don't have enough monitoring stations in Western Tibet and areas on those lines that would help tell us about, for example, the Indus River or Sutlej. So we, both in terms of causes and in terms of consequences, this is an international problem, which actually China has a vested interest in engaging internationally with. I don't think it's seeing it that way. It's seeing it in terms of control of fresh water. But there are those larger things, and those certainly can be looked at and should be.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Jennifer, I want to come back to you, if I may, and I'd like to fold in a question or a suggestion, actually, from the chat, the very dynamic chat that is going on alongside from participants. So first of all, just picking up on Martin's point, he's saying China doesn't see it that way currently, or he suspects they don't. How will China see it that way, and can China be persuaded to see it that way, do you think? And a lot of people are mentioning finance. So we heard that this is a global issue, or with global drivers. And as part of a solution, we're hearing a lot from COP26, after COP26, that the finance piece is going much faster than the diplomacy, and that's the key to anything. Is there a role that it would play here?
Thank you. I think that we like to talk about China as a homogenous entity, and that is partly because they do take great efforts to speak with one voice out into the world. But I think there are bits of China that are very much aware of this element. The question is whether they are predominant in the foreign policy conversations that are happening. And I think this is where bilateral diplomacy into China, as I know is already happening, around climate risk and extreme climate risk and what it means for China itself, needs to be sustained. Now, this is engagement through the EU, through the UK, through the US, through other regional partners. And a lot of that happens in back rooms, so we don't see it. But because it happens in back rooms, it is very much part of kind of bringing this element into the Chinese foreign policy space. There is more that it is needed there very clearly, and especially maybe support in terms of staffing a Himalayan council could be helpful. I'm not sure whether it would necessarily be welcome, but it could be helpful in actually getting it up and running, because one of the big things is you can't have a council like this if you don't have the humans to staff it. And I don't necessarily currently see India or China putting up the money for that. So maybe that is an offer that would need to be made bilaterally. But the big disconnect that I see as a problem in the Chinese context is the fact that right now there isn't really an interest and appetite in linking some of the extreme weather, the extreme impacts that we're seeing explicitly with climate change. And that is where kind of Chinese media is very interesting to observe, because they're obviously waking up to this issue very similarly to UK media, to European media, but it's a much slower progress. And sometimes it's even just an issue of having the language that is understandable by your population. And now this is very anecdotal and it is a bit outdated, so don't take my full word for it. But a very good Chinese friend works on mobility. And she said when she goes back home and explains to her grandmother what she's doing, she has to say that it's recycling, because that is the only environmental word that her grandmother knows. So very simply, there is just not the literal literacy on the climate issue. And I think that is changing fast in China. But barriers like these can be real issues, particularly when it comes to linking climate risk to climate action. I hope that answers part of the question, but I do think that these are the sort of dynamics that we really need to have a look at.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to Darren, who's asked the question, which has sort of partially been answered. How do we create a forum that can manage the international tensions with the region? With great difficulty, I would say, is the answer currently. I'd like to just take a quick sort of mop-up question in that this is a thing that was discussed and somebody had a question about it. This is from Christine. If fresh water and food becomes a problem, how much population displacement is expected? Martin, you referenced that, so I wonder if you could answer Christine's question to any degree.
Well, we don't know is the answer, and very much actually going back to Jennifer's point earlier, a lot of this actually depends on what we do right now. We do actually really need not just to move to net zero, but to actually reducing the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But particularly, there are problems the questions of pollution around the Tibetan plateau as a whole. All of those need to be really addressed with great urgency and fierceness. And we really need to push slightly beyond the political barriers as far as this is concerned. As far as the population movements are concerned, we're already seeing them in play. Now, some of them have actually been state constructed. I made reference to this at the very beginning. So, for example, China's eco-migration policy moved the Tibetan population off an area of the Tibetan plateau the size of France. They moved the nomads all off there because they felt that that was what the cause was. Now, actually, what they discovered later is it really wasn't the cause. But that was what they did there. But we are already seeing populations, individual families making individual choices because of the growing decline, because of the declining quality of their land and soil and everything on those lines. We're seeing that in China. You know, effectively speaking, people are kind of moving, they're voting with their feet already on this one. So there's a question about the level of political control that can be maintained as things get stronger. So acting now really is vital, and acting with 100 years hence as the goal, rather than just what we can do now. We actually really start having to make policy for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. That is where the greatest effect will be.
Okay, very well said. Joydeep, we're going to come to you just with that question from Christine about population displacement as well.
Right. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence that, especially in the high mountains, villages are getting depopulated. There is very little. There are very little numbers to uh, point to substantiate that, but there is a very interesting point that I would like to make here. So in India, like in many other parts of the world, the census, the population census, the detailed census happens every 10 years. The 2021 census hasn't happened because of COVID. So the last census for which we have data is the 2011 census. There are over 600 districts in the 30 states of India. Out of those 600 districts, only 2 districts in the entire country showed an absolute population decrease between 2001 and 2011. And these 2 districts were Nainital and Almora, bang in the middle of the Himalayas, in the state of Uttarakhand. So there is an absolute. So in a country where the population is going up, will soon be the most populous country in the world, there are 2 districts right in the middle of the mountains from which the population is actually decreasing. Very recently, we carried a story, I think last week or the week before that, from Himachal Pradesh, which is the adjacent state over there. And there also, we are finding exactly what Martin was talking about, that people are voting with their feet. So yes, people are finding that it is becoming absolutely impossible to live out there, and people are moving out.
Thank you. Very interesting and always very important to forensically look for the evidence of these things, which appears in all sorts of different places. I've just noticed the time. I wish we had another hour, but we don't. So we're going to have to wrap up, I'm afraid. And thank you for all the comments and questions. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists, I'm going to be one of those annoying conveners now, to answer very shortly with 2 points. So the first point is from Sachin Sharma. Is this reversible? You can say yes, you can no, say no, you can put another sentence on, but a very brief comment. And then I would like something that we can do. So something, a pressure point, something that we should be doing, a prioritization, a change in the mindset, in the way that we think of this, something that we can carry on from this discussion. Jennifer, I'm afraid I'm going to pick on you to go first. So those 2 points.
So for the first one, probably not completely, but we can definitely still influence how bad it gets. But that means acting this decade. On the second point, I do think there needs to be continued pressure behind a plurilateral format on this, a Himalayan Council. I think I've made it clear that it will be difficult, but in the same way that the US and Russia managed to cooperate in the middle of the Cold War, as this gets pressing enough, India and China will need to seek solutions where they can at least have joint dialogue on this. And I think keeping the pressure, keeping exploring how we can set that up is going to be really key.
And how can we do this? What do we do? Write to Antonio Guterres, or I mean, some of us here will have a lot of influence, and some people like me will have very little influence. So, is there any way of putting pressure as an individual?
I think it definitely. I mean, I'm sure Mr. Guterres would appreciate the letters. I think it is already on his radar, but I do think he has a role to play in facilitating this. I would also say, write if you're in the UK, if you're in the EU, if you're in the US, write to your MPs and say this is an important issue. We actually think that in terms of foreign policy, you should be talking to these countries about climate risk. What can we offer to support? I do think that is still important and effective, because this falls off the plate a lot of times, but it is actually in the medium term one of the most important things that we can do.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to you, Joydeep.
Okay, the answer to the first question is that it's no longer reversible, but it can definitely be slowed down with mitigation, with strong mitigation measures, as Jennifer has pointed out. So yes, it definitely can be slowed down. And then who knows, maybe in the next century we can start seeing a move towards the positive thing. On the second point, I have a slightly different point of view and I have some worries because we have, and I've been personally covering this, we have joint forums and we have the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, which has both China and India, apart from the other countries, as its members, and they do talk. If we take this to the level of the national security advisors in a border area, which is now the most militarized border in the world, because quite apart from all the other problems in the Himalayas, right now, it has thousands and thousands and thousands of Chinese, Indian, and Pakistani troops, all armed, all facing one another at very short distances, and all actually coming to blows far too often. And so, in this situation, I'm not at all sure if the strat-frat is the best way to go about it. It may actually worsen matters.
Okay, very interesting and very much noted. Martin.
Is it reversible? Yes, it is. It will take quite a while, about a century, to reverse it. The truth of the matter is reversing it is not something we can do very much. The Earth's natural processes will soak up that carbon dioxide as long as we stop adding to it. There's the real crucial bit. The Earth's capacity and its natural processes to act as carbon dioxide sinks are still effective and powerful, but we must not cripple them and we must not add to the problem. And so, effectively speaking, allowing the Earth to, in effect, do that job for us, which it has always been doing for us, but we've just ignored it, allowing and making space for that in our policy, and policy that is really designed long range. We have to start thinking long range policy, not what we're going to do for this generation or even the next generation, but the generations beyond that, because otherwise, they're going to dig us up from our graves and spit on our bones for what we've done.
Well, that's a pretty powerful idea to end this session on. I must say, I'm really gutted to have to stop here, but this is, everyone has things to do. This has been one of the most powerful, informative, and insightful sessions that I've had the pleasure to be involved in over the last few months, and that includes everything at COP, frankly. I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists for giving up their precious time, to Joydeep, to Martin, and to Jennifer. I hope we get to talk about this again, but I want to say thank you to all of you for giving your time, and Lavina for asking me to chair this from the subs bench, because what an honor. I do work in the media, and all I can say is that I'm taking away some incredibly powerful similes and a much greater understanding from this session alone this morning. All I can do is say that I will promise to tell as much of this story and as powerfully, and come to these guests as much as I can for comments, because this is really, for me, how this conversation needs to be told, and how this narrative and storytelling needs to be pushed out, is exactly this story, and exactly as we've heard the truth today, the unvarnished truth. But thank you so much for joining us. I know there's a lot of battle for your attention, and thank you to Open Forum for hosting this very, very important debate, and I hope we get to speak soon. So goodbye from me, and thank you again.
Goodbye.